it's really my total pleasure and honor to be introducing these two wonderful books that I had been looking forward to reading the two books for quite some time, ever since I learned they were coming. And these are really amazing, very important contributions to what is a crucial topic in South America, but also globally in terms of the role of industrial agriculture as a very powerful industrial hyper-globalized system that has clear implications socially, environmentally, in terms of the climate and ecological crisis. In current discussions about climate change, we tend to perhaps talk too much about the fossil fuel industry and forget that industrial agriculture is a major force behind major environmental and climatic crisis and problems we're facing globally. And these two books, in being both profoundly ethnographic and conceptually sophisticated, offer us this really fantastic counterpoint between the two countries that have had a major presence in the so-called soy boom in South America. Amalia Leguizamón, as a sociologist from Argentina based at Tulane University in the US, she's been covering the case of Argentina for many years. And Kregg Hetherington, who teaches anthropology at Concordia University in Montreal, has been also doing the same in the case of Paraguay, working with campesino activists and also officials in many parts of the country. So what I love about the two books is how they build on long-term fieldwork and a long-term commitment to addressing these very complex political, environmental, social processes from the bottom up and through an ethnographic perspective. I have so many questions about both books, but I wanted to maybe begin with Amalia and ask you first, and this is a question I'll also ask Kregg, especially for those of you listening and unfamiliar with their work, how you got interested in the topic of seeds and power in Argentina. And secondly, something that really stands out in your book, among many of the other things you analyze, is the issue of gender, the role of this, on the one hand, this hegemonic acceptance of soybeans and GMOs in Argentina, but at the same time, how there are very notable gender differences in how women and men, especially in the core agricultural area of Argentina, in the Pampas, how that operates. So yeah, that would be my first question to you, Amalia.
Thank you, Gaston, and thank you for taking the lead on doing this. I'm very happy to be here. And speaking with Kregg, also loving his book. I got into the topic in grad school, like many of us, right? Like we end up in grad school, like thinking about that we're going to be doing something, and then we end up doing something completely different. I was lucky to be taking a class on environmental sociology with Ken Gould, who was my advisor. And at that time, I had become very much interested in environmental social movements because for my master's thesis, I was studying the environmental conflict in Gualeguaychú in Argentina, in the frontier with Paraguay, which was probably one of the first times in Argentina that a conflict was like the grievances were around the environment, right? So I was trying to understand how the environmentalism that was seen in the United States was around resources and about livelihoods. So that opened me into this new literature. I also, being in New York, I was very much concerned about food issues because Michael Pollan had written his book. So everyone was talking about food and everyone was talking about GMOs, but they were very anti-GMOs. So I was reading Bandana Shiva, and I was very much involved into this anti-GMO discourse. So by the time 2008 hit, and I was in grad school and I was struggling to find the question for the dissertation, this massive conflict with the countryside happened where soybean producers were organizing in a massive protest that lasted 3 months in Argentina to protest against a tax hike, right? So it was totally mind-blowing to be in New York City learning about soybean expansion in my country, of which I had heard very little of, even though I'm a Pampas person. I'm from the south of Argentina, Bahia Blanca, my city. It's surrounded by the countryside. Yet everyone kept talking about wheat and cows, and this expansion of soybean had been happening a little bit on the background. And suddenly it was all over in the media, and yet the protest was not around the social and ecological negative consequences of soybean expansion, but rather around tax. So the question became, thanks to my advisor who helped me put this together, like I was very much, like the question became, why is it that in the beginning the question was, why is it that there is no anti-GMO movement in Argentina? But then by the time that I started doing field work, it hit me on my head. Like I was literally slapped on the face, because I was silly or naive enough to ask that question to producers and agronomists, like, why is there no movement? And everyone was like, what do you mean? We do the best agriculture in the world. Literally, people kept telling me that, like, why? There's nothing wrong with this. And it took me quite a long time to, first of all, to keep the question for myself, right? Not to like be out there being so combative about it. But it also, by keeping the question to myself, and I started asking questions about technology, right? It did take me a while to start listening to what these agronomists and producers were telling me about how this is good for the country and how is the technological prowess, because it asked me to start looking into the discourses of why this the technological innovation was part of this national identity of modernity that Argentines have, right? Like that there is a pride around the progress of the countryside, particularly in the Pampas, of course, and we can talk about the distinctions between the Pampas region and the outside. But then what happened was that as I was doing this field work, and this was also an unintended consequence of the field work, is that as I was spending time in the countryside in these rural households, I became to realize that I was spending a lot of time with women in ways that I haven't even thought about. I was coming from New York City, right? Grad school, there are no gender differences or divisions at the university in New York City, but suddenly I'm in this very traditional households in which women do something and men do other things. And what the men do is that they organize production, they go into the field, they get their hands dirty. So suddenly, or not so suddenly, and this also, it took me, it was time in my head to realize the dissonance of what the men were telling me about the agricultural prowess of the country and how nothing was wrong, to what was happening in this backstage, in the kitchens. And when the men were not around, that some women, that when they became quite confident with me, they started telling me that they were slightly terrified or slightly worried about agrochemical contamination. But it was all in murmurs and whispers, and when the men came in, they would like suddenly shut up. So it was a huge cognitive dissonance, and it with time it ended up being the articulation of the book, right? Of trying to see what do these gender discourses have to tell us about, as you say, the possible alternatives of difference. So we might be able to do something else.
But if I may add a subsequent question, you add an interesting kind of class twist when you shift to the case of the Madres de Ituzaingó, this kind of more working class area in the province of Córdoba, where you also have a gender dynamic, but it's slightly different, right? Because of these women's different class background, something else happens, right? So would you like to tell us a little bit more about how women who are not middle class, who don't benefit economically from the soy boom, actually they were willing to act on their concerns over fumigations, right?
Yes, definitely. Something that was quite interesting when I did meet these Madres of Barrio Ituzaingó, which are one of the first groups to organize against agrochemical spray in Argentina, is that they demobilize a language that is around the maternal instinct to protect children, right? And that is quite common. I mean, it is a pattern in the literature on environmental justice that we see mothers organized around the protection of children and the community, and that extends into the protection of nature and the environment. Shannon Bell, working with Women in Appalachia, comes out with some conclusions, right? There's all this literature. But the interesting thing about the women who silence are that these women are put in this bind that they are middle class women. They are upper class women that are tied. They're actually married into the soybean business, and that puts them into an internal bind, right? Like these are no women that are capable of protesting. They don't have a background. This is what I appreciate about the reading Kregg's work, right? Like it is quite clear that the soybean producers are the others, right? They are the brasileños, they are the foreigners. And then the campesinos are trying to plant cotton, are trying to do something else. These women that I was spending my time with, they were feeding and clothing their children from the money from soybeans. And this had become particularly important because in the decades before, the Pampas were in crisis, right? So coming out from an economic crisis, now suddenly there is a boom that is truly feeling like trickling down through the community. And these families are doing better. They're doing economically better. Their husbands are doing it. They are doing this work that is pleasant, that is comfortable, that pays well, that gives you status in the community. So the women as wives, they're not just mothers, but they're wives. So they worry as mothers, but as wives, they have to take the backseat. And I mean, I do argue that they do get trapped, right, in this situation in which they finally trade patronage. They trade, right? They trade their well-being and the well-being of their children in the short term for staying silent and not speaking up and protesting like the other mothers do.
Thank you. So now I would like to shift gears to Kregg's book and again, I mean, the counterpoint between Paraguay and Argentina, like I said before, is absolutely fascinating. We have, on the one hand, the same type of agribusiness model, but at the same time, socially, politically, we see a very different environment. And what Kregg shows is how during the Lugos government, we see, even if it was a kind of not a very radical experiment, but there was an attempt to regulate the beans, hence the Kregg's wonderful concept, the government of beans. So my question to you, Kregg, is again to hear a little bit more about how you came to this topic. Obviously, you've been working in Paraguay for a long time, and specifically, you started working with campesino organizations and movements. So, yeah, tell us a little bit about how the argument of the book started originally, but also I was very intrigued by this counterpoint you draw between the government of beans and the soy state. So if you'd like to tell us a little bit about that tension in the Paraguayan case.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, thank you so much for doing this, and it's great to get to know you, Amalia. Finally, it's been really fun to think about these two books together for a lot of the reasons you describe. So for me, it really started at the end of a previous project that you were just alluding to, where I had done my field work, and my first book was on campesino organizing, mostly around land. So it was around bureaucracy and land and how people got access to titles and how people fought over what ownership was all about. In the context of kind of the end of a land reform period and the advancement of a what had been called the kind of global land grab. So there was a lot of new concentration of land going on. But during that project, I always had trouble figuring out what to do with what actually a lot of the activists were telling me, which was that the entire problem that they were facing was soybeans. That it was this kind of plant, this whole new way of thinking agriculture that came with this very specific plant and the technological package around it, that was causing them all this grief, and it seemed to require a kind of analytic shift of lens. And so when it came time to kind of figure out a new project, that's what I wanted to do. But it coincided historically with this really important moment for Paraguay, which is that Paraguay had been for decades and decades ruled by a single party, this kind of conservative agrarian party. And in 2008, a lot of the activists who I had been in touch with or living with, and who were anti-soy in different kinds of ways, who were organized against the onslaught of soy, became part of this coalition that rose to power in the Paraguayan government, displacing the previous Colorado party, and kind of putting this slightly ragtag coalition of folks in charge of the executive, and gave them the opportunity to try to say, okay, for years we've been organizing against this version of agriculture and all of the harms, the environmental and social and economic harms that we see associated with it. Now we're in government. What do we do about it? And that happened right as I was trying to shift my own kind of analytic gears, and it became the basis for the book itself, which at its core is the story of what happens to these people as they come into these regulatory positions and try to translate their activism into a kind of regulatory action. And so to get to the second part of your question, there was always this tension that was present from the beginning, of what a lot of these folks were experiencing as they moved into this regulatory apparatus. Was that on the one hand they had spent all of this time previously kind of coming up as political actors, being against the state, and the state was always this corrupt thing that was responsible for a lot of the bad stuff they saw around them, including the rise of soybean agriculture. And then all of a sudden they're part of it, and they have to figure out how to now relate to the state, and through the state to relate to beans in a new kind of way. So it was very common in those early days to hear people talk about Paraguay as an estado sojero, which is kind of like how we would imagine a petrostate, which is a small state that is just so wrapped in a particular model of resource extraction that it's hard to imagine your way out of it. So they already had that critique in mind as they came into government, and then the question was, were they able to detach themselves from the estado sojero to be something other than the soy state while they were there? Would they be able to govern beans in a new way? Or would they ultimately be co-opted by the estado sojero? And this was something that people actively talked about as they were entering these offices and becoming functionaries. Was how do we figure out how to do this? And so the story is ultimately a story of kind of failure. It's also a story in which the government of beans, it was, as I've named it, because that's not a name that people were using down there, was kind of this emergent phenomenon. It was always this sort of attempt to figure out how to make of the various harms that they were worried about, to make them into a regulable object, and ultimately never quite being able to. And so when Lugo is ultimately thrown out of the government in a coup, there's obviously a whole bunch of reasons for that, but one of the very clear ways that you can read that situation is seeing the soy state reestablishing itself. And then one of the kind of ironies of the way to think about regulatory power in this way is because the Lugo and the bureaucrats around him had spent so much time trying to build up the regulatory capacity of the state in order to push back the soybeans. That capacity immediately became available to the soy industry once the soy state reestablishes itself, and arguably led to an even bigger boom that happened as soon as he was out of power.
Thank you. And as a follow-up question, I mean, a key concept in your book that I also love is this idea of agribiopolitics, which I guess connects both the government of beans and the soy state. Could you tell us a little bit about how and why is this concept so central in your argument?
Yeah, so one of the things that the book tries to do is to figure out how to tell this story, right? And I divided it into three sections where I tell three somewhat different versions of what the story could be. The middle one is the one that is really the story of the rise and fall of the government of beans is in the middle, and that the beginning one is the one that really kind of sets the stage for understanding what soybeans were doing in Paraguay and how anti-soy politics came to be. So exactly what was lacking in the context that Amalia was just discussing in Paraguay was always very, very, very present, because there was this huge swath of rural peoples who were excluded from the soybean boom directly. And so the politics of being anti-soy was much clearer and much stronger right from the beginning. That really is the contrast that's most clear from one side of the Paraguay-Argentina border to the other side. So that's the first section of the book. And then what I tried to do afterwards was to set this in the context in a longer genealogical context, which I'm calling agrobiopolitics. It's really a way of trying to get to the way that the state has enabled, really since the late 19th century, the rise and continued complexification of the Green Revolution. So the moment at which the state becomes much more involved in crop development, but also in regulating the health of plants. So as crops get bigger and run into more and more problems in terms of pests, in terms of diseases, and so on, how have all these apparatuses been built up around these monocrops in order to kind of stabilize them and to make them keep going? And what I find really interesting about that history of kind of the regulation of the health of plants, so what's called phytosanitary regulation, is that you can see in that it's always had this double-edged potential. It's the same infrastructure that gets used to try to stabilize these very, very fragile biotic constructs, which are these huge monocrops. It's the same infrastructure that gets used to try to protect people's health from all of the various harmful effects of using all these chemicals that you have to use on the crops. So the way that piece of the regulatory apparatus that we often don't really pay much attention to, but that is absolutely crucial to having large-scale monocrop agriculture, is also the thing that activists are interested in doing, because it's going to be the piece that regulates pesticide use, and that tries to standardize the kind of epidemiological knowledge that is required in order to make arguments against widespread monocropping. And so they really do go together. And ultimately, depending on whether you have a more environmentally focused or a more production focused government in hand, they're still kind of building the same apparatus and using the same machines and to a certain extent the same kind of knowledge production techniques in order to try to understand the crops and enable their existence.
Which kind of thinking again about the counterpoint between Argentina and Paraguay, and maybe I would like now to shift to Amalia's book. In the case of Paraguay, we see a brief attempt by a progressive government to kind of try to rein on the excesses of the soy boom. In Argentina, we have a very different case in which we, under Nestor and Cristina Kirchner in the first 12 years of Kirchnerismo, we also had a progressive government, or a government that is identified as progressive. Yet, as you show, Amalia, they they never got to do what they did under Lugo in Paraguay. You highlight the issue of consent hegemony. So can you tell us a little bit about how and this continues today with Alberto Fernandez's government in Argentina, also kind of a Peronist Kirchnerista government that, again, despite claiming to be progressive, they don't dare to really touch, or at least if they do it in a very kind of lukewarm or timid way. So my question to you, Amalia, is like, especially after listening to Kregg talk about Paraguay, can you tell us a bit about how you see that operating in Argentina in terms of how even progressives in power in Argentina, they largely, as you say, they may debate about how much to tax soybeans when they're exported, but the model itself is quite hegemonic in the sense that, with the exception of the activists that you mentioned, and I would like to maybe go back to that point later, but in other words, how do you see the progressive governments in Argentina in their attempts to accommodate the soy state?
Thank you for that question. I think that the Argentine case it's much more common than to other progressive governments of the left turn that have happened, like what happened with Chavez in Venezuela, particularly with Correa in Ecuador, with Morales, compared and different to what Kregg experienced in Paraguay, that the Argentine government, from the Kirchners on, actually from Dualde on 2003, have been able to capture a substantial chunk of export revenue, right? And for a country like Argentina that was coming out of the huge debt and economic social, political crisis that was in 2001, it was, in a way, a perfect storm in the sense, or actually a perfect bounty. So internationally, we see a rising commodity prices for soybeans, but also for gas, fossil fuels, gas, oil, but particularly for Argentina for soybeans. At the same time that there is increasing demand from China and India, right? So it does become for the Argentine government a huge source of revenue, which really you cannot turn that down. So I always found myself in the situation of how can you think this otherwise? And there is this phrase that Rafael Correa said after the Chasuni ITT project failed, the project that where he had pledged, this was 2007, 2008, I don't remember the year exactly, but he has said, we, Ecuador, we can pledge not to dig Amazonian oil if the international community gives us some money in exchange, right? Because we're poor, we need money. The international community said no, so then he started digging, right? But this dilemma is the same for all these poor countries. You have a government that particularly a government like the Kirchnerista, like the Peronistas, that they are voted in on the promise to give social welfare, but you enter into politics without having any money on your pockets. And suddenly, I mean, not suddenly, right? But suddenly commodities become very, very expensive, and you have a country that is tagged along, that has a history of being an agrarian exporter, right? So for Argentina, all this comes quite smoothly, and this is something that I try to explain in the book, right? That this is not something that just happened. It's not that this technology comes off the sky and then it's suddenly like it's completely revolutionizing what farmers do. No, there's a history. There is an environmental and social history in which the pampas have always been the motor of Argentina's economy, and this is, as for what producers solve, this is just another technology that suddenly becomes quite productive, right? So the government, the Kirchner government, does take advantage of that, and it does become, it is a smooth alliance between the state and the agribusinesses until 2008 hits with the tax hike. right? And then there is a division, and this is what I say in the book, and many other people said this too, right? But the interesting thing is that the split becomes discursive, but it's not it's merely discursive, because the government doesn't do anything at all to try to rein in production. And on the contrary, and compared to what Kregg writes about, that at least the government of beings is trying to rein in the worst social and environmental impacts of soybean production, the Argentine government makes a mockery of trying to letting the movements do some protest, but then figuring out ways in which to bring them down. And that has continued, right? It continued with Macri. Now it's now again with Fernandez and Kirchner. And even last week, there was a big protest in Argentina, where this distinction between El Campo, that represents the nation, right, and they wave flags as a way to protest against the government continues. But in terms of policy towards the countryside, there are more events of genetically modified crops being accepted. Only just last week, Argentina approved the planting for commercialization and use of genetically modified wheat. We're the first country to do that. So technological innovation continues. The expansion of monocrops continues. And I think everyone is trying to make a good profit out of it.
It's also interesting how, even though Fernandez and even though the Kirchners in general have been very supportive of soy agribusiness, because they also tax them, that creates a lot of hostility and animosity from the farmers and the agribusiness lobby. So they're never happy with, even though again the government eventually favors their logic of accumulation. At the same time, there's a lot of hostility and animosity. And I guess that's a question I have for both of you. Both books show how all this activism against fumigations, even against the toxicity of the soy model, has first faced a profound hostility from the media, from powerful sectors. And maybe I'll shift to you, Kregg. You show how basically when the government of beings under Lugo collapsed with the coup, all this hatred against campesinos and against those officials who had, worked hard to, basically try to address the concerns of campesinos being fumigated in the countryside. We see this pretty intense or horrible backlash against them framed. So anyway, I would like maybe both of you to tell us a little bit more about how the backlash against activism about GMOs and fumigations operating in both countries. I think both books capture that pretty graphically.
Yeah, I could jump in on that. I mean, I think there are two ways. Part of the framing I wanted to give it is that is to have at least two different temporalities in which to think about that, right? And on the one hand, the backlash was really strong and severe, and we've seen this in countries all over the region, right? As these pink tide governments have fallen, and the move against them has been radical and cynical, and often and in many cases violent. And so in the case of Paraguay, you have not only sort of the immediate and rapid removal of people from their offices, and I have in the book a couple of anecdotes of sort of what that experience was like of being sort of physically ousted from these places, but then also the deployment of police to physically guard soy fields from these, what had by then been kind of imagined as these phantom communist peasants who were out to destroy all productivity in the countryside. So there is this kind of extreme backlash. But at another frame, you can see that these events sort of are little blips in the overall expansion of the way this model kind of keeps rolling along. And maybe to echo back some of what Amalia was saying, we're both working in these contexts that could be called neo-extractivists, where you have, in the same way that you can have family units that are dependent on the soybeans, and it therefore becomes very complicated to think your way outside of soybeans because your entire family welfare is based on the income that you get from that. I think a lot of these states are in a very analogous situation where there's a project to expand the welfare state and a particular kind of biopolitical imaginary around making the lives of people better in those senses, but they're absolutely dependent on the income that comes from these various kinds of extraction. And so one of the things that I wanted to point to also with the agrobiopolitical kind of lens is to say that whenever we have these life projects for people, and often the anti-GMO or the anti-pesticide politics are couched in terms of life, are couched in terms of trying to make life better. They're sort of overlooking the fact that all these welfare projects that we've had going from the 20th century have also been based on this massive amount of environmental destruction and the rolling out of these different kinds of technologies. And it's not just by regulating one form of or peeling back one form of production and production of life, which is the monocrop form, that you're suddenly going to leave room for the welfare state to flourish, or for healthcare to flourish, or something like that. So even though in Argentina that was always really, really clear, it was clear that the Kirchnerist project was to use revenue from soybean taxation to increase the welfare state. In Paraguay, it was never quite that clear. The taxation was always much lower. It was harder to sort of see the way that that relationship might play out. But not only did functionaries find themselves stuck in that, find themselves having to promote soybeans in order to be able to do the other projects that they wanted to do, which were anti-soybeans. But you could see it happening at the micro level on the ground as well, where soybean producers would fund the local health clinic, and these different kinds of things that make it much harder to, I'm trying to remember Amalia's language here, but to disentangle oneself from thinking about the soy economy in order to be able to properly be against it. And so I think part of what happened in Paraguay is that being against it was actually really easy at a certain point, and it became increasingly harder as people tried to mobilize resources to actually sort of do something about what they were against.
Thank you. And Amalia, would you like to comment on this same question in the case of Argentina?
I think that the case of Argentina, and this is what struck me about just opening Kregg's book, is that for me, for my case, what it took me so long even to try to conceptualize this is, how do I prove that there is no protest? And Kregg starts saying, la soja mata, soy kills. And I'm like, oh, I wish I could have said that. but I literally have to go through the book to very slowly show how soy kills. So it's a little bit of, Kregg states this, right? This is like this slow violence that is happening, right? For me, the trick, the trick of telling the story is, how do I tell you that this slow violence is happening? And that meant that I couldn't start with the activism, right? Because I also wanted to put the activism in context, because, now by this time in Argentina, things have changed much, luckily, and talking about pesticides and contamination and glyphosate and Roundup it's much common, and many people still don't debate that there are negative consequences around soybean expansion, but soybean activism is still quite limited, and the groups of people that I found to be more quote unquote successful, right, in terms of are their demands being heard and translated into policy, are actually mostly urban and peri-urban groups, right? And these are particularly the people in Córdoba, and I tried to and so then the thing that happens is that the backlash against this type of activism, it is violent in many ways, but it's less violent than the violence that it is inflicted against campesino families, but in the north of Argentina. And this is happening, right, in the Chaco, in the north, certainly. But the violence that can be inflicted against urban women is kind of different, right? Particularly because of the visibility that happens, right? And this, and I try to tell this also in a story of women activism in Argentina around the Mothers of Plaza de Mayo, right? And how the women actually used these identities to protect against state violence, because it looks quite bad if you have the army, right, shooting on women, right? And that was a strategy, but at the same time, it's a strategy, and I also talk about this in the book, is that the strategy also backlashes onto them, because by using this maternalist politics, they are protected from extreme violence, but they are also not taken too seriously, because you woman go back to the household, right? Like, you're only a housewife. What do you know? Particularly talking about experts. And in addition to that, and in comparison to Kregg's book, I also found that it was important to, when talking about activism in Argentina, was to talking about how the movements, particularly this anti-pesticide movement, were so strategic and had to work so hard in order to create a popular epidemiology. Like, what I found very interesting about Kregg's book is that it is the government of beings, the experts are coming and the bureaucrats are coming to try to figure out how they figured out the epidemiology, right? Like, what are the protocols? How do they measure? How do they take samples? All that in Argentina, because the movements don't have the respect from the state, or they don't have the ear from the state, they have to figure out ways in which to make alliances with experts at the local universities that are friends and allies, to try to create their own data. And that is a lot of work, emotional labor. But that happened, the agribiopolitics is not imposed, but actually the movements the activists need to figure out a way in which to enter and speak the regulatory language in order to get protections. So I think that that's a neat way in which the books talk back to back.
Absolutely. And my last question for both of you would be, I mean, building from the same discussion, thinking forward, in terms of the future alternatives to this powerful hegemony of soy agribusiness. I mean, both books show the immense power of the soy state in both countries. At the same time, both books show how there are spaces for resistance, activism, which, even though those haven't been, I mean, they were at one point pretty influential in Paraguay. That attempt was pushed back. In Argentina, as you say, Amalia, they're still, especially in the north, which is, I mean, the area I know best, there's very strong anti-GMO and anti-agribusiness activism, but as you point out, they're still, they're mostly poor campesinos. They don't have the visibility they have, for instance, in Paraguay. So my question is, building from these spaces of, confrontation, activism, and both of you hint at there are potentialities there for potential alternatives to this model. So my question, as a provocation in terms of how to think, not only in terms of how depressing in many ways this picture is. We should admit that, in many ways, these are industries that are extremely powerful and also very destructive, as you both point out. But at the same time, there are a lot of people, not only in these two countries, but all over the world, trying to rethink how we grow food, especially in a world facing a profound climate and ecological crisis. And I think in both countries, we see people trying to work collectively and quite creatively in trying to find alternatives to these industrial agriculture model used on intense use of agrochemicals. So I guess my question is, in terms of the the glass, the half glass versus half empty glass tension. Where would you see spaces for a different type of agricultural model in both countries? I mean, or where can you see spaces for optimism or potential change moving forward in both Argentina and Paraguay, but also globally? Because obviously, as both of you know, this is part of a global phenomenon. There are many activists worldwide pushing for alternatives to industrial agriculture. So yeah, that will be my final question.
Sure. I mean, if maybe we should make it glass 10% full. But I did find, I mean, going back to Amalia's comparison between the books, I felt like in many ways they were the mirror image of each other, precisely because Amalia is telling a story of a harm that is hard to define and is hard to represent, which then slowly over the course of the book becomes more and more clear. And so it's great. There is this sort of narrative arc where you can finally point at the end to certain kinds of activism that have had certain kinds of success. Whereas my book starts out with people thinking it's really clear. The movement of which in Paraguay also was led by mothers initially, this kind of movement to define la soja mata slowly unravels over time as people find it more and more difficult to actually back up the political definiteness they had with the kinds of legal and scientific knowledge that they would need to do what they wanted to do from the case of the state. So when I started writing this book, it was very much in a space of kind of feeling a little bit deflated, not just me, but all the folks that I had done field work with, who'd been thrown out of government after, working just so hard for so many years to try to make this happen. Not only had it not happened, but the whole sort of project seemed to have collapsed on them. And I'd say, the thing that really came out of that as a lesson for most of the activists that I was involved with was something that always percolates in these movements, right? Even though the state and the capture of the state is always a very tempting way of trying to make large-scale changes over things, that I think most of them said, you know what, actually, we're going to go back to our gardens and we're going to treat those, rather than the state itself, as kind of an experiment. The gardens and the communities become experimental spaces, which they always were before, but sort of those kinds of small scale projects got shunted to the side as the jewel of being in control of a centralized state became a possibility. And so one of the things that I try to kind of weave throughout the book is a lot of different stories, even going back as far as the 19th century, of folks who in fact were involved with the Green Revolution and involved with creating the conditions of possibility for this massive monocrop situation that we have now, and showing that actually in each of those moments there were always all kinds of possibilities, and there were all kinds of different sorts of life projects at play. They just sort of end up building up towards this one other way of doing things. And so the way, at least conceptually, to imagine one's politics otherwise within this, to my mind, isn't to be anti-soy, but to imagine agriculture as this like constantly multiplying kind of space of life possibilities, and then figuring out which ones of those life possibilities one is going to try to nourish at the expense of others. And if you think of a monocrop really as an extreme form of biological assemblage that nonetheless has variation within it, where is it that we find that variation, and how do we try to increase the potential of those sorts of things? So whether it's people going back and trying to take more seriously agroecological possibilities, or just kind of small scale farming of different sorts and actually making that work, or whether it's moving into thinking about different ways of moving food around, so increasing market potential in these regional areas. Those are the sorts of things that, at least in the immediate aftermath of the government of Bean, seem to hold whatever potential there was left of that assemblage of activism that was there.
Thank you, Kregg.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I do struggle with this question about how to be optimist, and what I loved about Kregg's book is, I mean, also in this sadness that you, Kregg, you're always telling us, the audience, this is great, but it's going to fail. I'm going to tell you how. So, and I felt that I wrote my book a little bit in the same spirit, because my book is like grounded in the literature and environmental justice, and it seems that most people are writing about these struggles as this is the hope. And what I kept seeing for my case is that this is not working. This is not working. This thing is just way too big, and it's so ingrained in how this country operates that even well-intentioned people are failing. So I do struggle with optimism. Now, in terms of where space is, at the same time, I have the question closed, and I've been trying to think, as I close this project, try to think about where these spaces are. And I'm thinking and hoping what has been happening in the last few years in Argentina is that the movements against agrochemical spraying has been growing, right? And there is much more awareness, and there is much more movements that are called paren de fumigar, like stop fumigations. And that has been happening in multiple localities around the different provinces. Now, as I explained in the book, in Argentina, there is no national law that regulates all agrochemicals, right? So different provinces have different rules. And within each province, different municipalities have different ordinances in terms of what is the distance between fumigations and homes, up to a point that for most places you can fumigate glyphosate, Roundup, glyphosate, the agrochemical that is used in conjunction with soybeans, up to people's front door. And some people do that on purpose, which is kind of crazy. But more and more, as people have becoming aware of this, they have been organizing and demanding buffer zones, right? So you don't fumigate near the school, near the hospital. Now, I find, and I have been trying to think more and more about this, because in terms of the spaces of opportunity that these buffer zones create, because once you set a buffer zone that is 2,000 meters between the city, the school, the hospital, and the farm, right, the monocrop farm, that space becomes available. And what do you do with that spaces? And what has been happening is that because you cannot fumigate in those areas, like use chemical pesticides or fertilizers, people have been starting to do agroecological practices there, right, in order to grow food for the community. Now, what if then you can fight for an extra buffer zone and expand that? So then it's the opposite of the extraction frontier expanding and encroaching into the community, but is an agroecological permaculture frontier intruding into the monocrop. So I find the idea beautiful. At the same time, I've been talking to producers, and you, Kregg, also mentioned this, like if for a producer that gets all that territory taken from their monocrop farm, particularly for people that have a small hectareage, they don't want that, right? So then the frontier again becomes a site of contention. But it can be not anymore as like a space for the accumulation of capital, right? But something to take over for the communities. That would be an opportunity. At the same time, I find extremely sad and disconcerting that at this time in Argentina, there are the massive wildfires spread because of the expansion of soybeans. and yet exports have not stopped. I've been following lately what has been happening with the containers, the export boats that need to take the soybeans out from the Rosario area, right, from where all the soybeans from Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina come, and they are shipped into China. And because of the fires and because of the droughts that are happening in the Paraná River, right? So because of climate change, the Paraná River is dry. So then those boats cannot be full. So what has been happening is that now those boats are being shipped into the south of Argentina, to Bahia Blanca, in order to be filled up, right? Because for every meter of your container that you don't fill, those are millions of dollars lost. So now those soybeans need to be trucked into the south of Argentina in order to fill those containers to be shipped to China. So the export business continues. And under COVID, that has been deemed essential service. So to answer your question, I think there are spaces of optimism, but when you put it in the context, the macro context and the forces against it, it's just a little bit.
Yeah, and can I just say, building on, so in Amalia's book, she often refers to the kind of the treadmill of agriculture expansion, and it's very clear in this. I mean, on the one hand, and for those who aren't familiar with the context, the destruction is absolutely astonishing. So the amount of deforestation, the effect on the water tables, and then all of these fires now is just this really dramatic kind of exposition of how much the non-monocrop landscape has been exposed to these kinds of harm. It is really dramatic, and it's very clear that the momentum there's no momentum shift behind this yet in the space. So it's a scary place to kind of think the Anthropocene with, which is where you started, Gaston, to kind of think about how much the whole apparatus is still going, guns blazing in this one direction, which even as it starts to crumble in on itself.
Certainly, and if I may tag on that, I think that the problem is that at least for Argentina now, and in many, actually most industrialized countries, is that the solution is being provided as more technology. Let's throw more technology at it. So this is what this new varieties of genetically modified seeds are about. They are drought resistant, right? So try to figure out what new technological innovation we can throw into the mix in order to keep the treadmill moving, which actually accelerates the ecological devastation.
Yeah, and that's why I think actually, precisely because of that reason, all these attempts to create agroecological forms of farming, as we know, it is the only way forward to get out of this trap, right, of doubling down on the same model of destruction. And yeah, the case of the fires affecting so many parts of Paraguay, Argentina, South America, and the west coast of North America, closer to me in my case, it's a reminder that this is not sustainable as we know. I mean, it's like we're in a kind of the suicidal machinery. Yet I do think I fully agree that the picture is grim, but at least I always find very encouraging how the activists I work with in northern Argentina, how they are trying to come up with new ways of growing food that are not that destructive. Obviously, they are localized, they are not that influential, but I do think if there's any hope at all, is in those kind of efforts to rethink how we live on planet Earth. I mean, the issue of, as Kregg puts it, it's about regulating life and the reproduction of life on Earth, human and non-human, and obviously agriculture has a central role on this question. So maybe to wrap things up, again, these are extremely thought-provoking, amazing books. I just wanted to ask you if you have any final thoughts or ideas you would like to mention about your books as final thoughts or remarks that we haven't covered.
I mean, I guess the only last thing that I would say about this is that part of the project for me was to try to figure out how to represent all the uncertainty that goes into to the kind of project that the government of beans represents. And so the problem of trying to pin down what it is that the problem is a central kind of dynamic that I saw going on here, and which felt to me like also a central dynamic of kind of the whole Anthropocenic problem that we're in right now, right? Is that so much of the issue with getting our societies off the bad habits that we sort of know are bad, but we don't really know how to disentangle ourselves from, are very clear in this relatively localized, even though it's got global repercussions, kind of example of how things go forward. But that uncertainty is also part of where you can find these bits of hopefulness, right? So I tried to write the book in such a way that nothing is ever completely sewn up, either for good or for bad. So even though the activists try really hard to sew up everything in order to be able to regulate it effectively, and they fail, the very fact that they can't sew it up is also an indication that nobody else quite can either. And that's where I see all these sorts of possibilities for other kinds of life to spring up in the margins and the interstices of these of this kind of system.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Amalia, do you know anything else about the book you would like to tell us about?
I'm not sure. I think that what I wanted to do with the book was to try to problematize the literature I was working with, and I'm looking forward to my second book, to see how I can get rid of the constraints of dissertation thinking. But most significantly, I think that the book, or what I tried to do with the book, was to try to problematize the key a key issue for thinking about the political economy of the environment. There is resource extractivism because resource extractivism gives money, right? That is the easy answer, and everyone kept telling me, well, the question of why there's so much acceptance around soybeans, or why there is no movement against it, is because it gives money. It's well, yeah, but what else? How do you make that complex? How do you problematize that? Trying to look into the discourses and identities that are around agrarian technological innovation in Argentina, for me, became key. And around gender divisions and around race and racism was central. And also try to, I think that, I try to put also the lens onto a group of people, or a category of people that environmental sociologists are not putting a lot of emphasis on, which is regular people in the everyday, right? So there's a lot of effort in thinking in social movement studies, in environmental studies in general, into looking at the movements, right? Where are the spaces of opportunity? What are these people doing? Which is a great question, and of course drives us as sociologists, right? We want to see where change is happening, right? What are these forward-thinking people that are bringing the change we need? But to me, what struck me is that there was a lot of doing the same, and what struck me even the most was what happened with these people that are bearing some negative impacts, right? They are being fumigated with these agrochemicals and yet insist that this is helping them. So this is quite a rotten question about how power gets reproduced, but it is also a question that doesn't get explored enough, right? What is it that we do as regular people? What is it that we middle classes do to try to keep maintaining a system that is certainly not working? How do we negotiate that in our everyday to continue with life and put these grievances that are clearly grievances on the side, because I'm going to keep busy? When I found that to be an intriguing question in and of itself, even though by the end it didn't give me answers, because it doesn't give you hope. But what I was hoping is that the more that we bring this up, talk about this, at least we can make visible how power works in a way that then, like, it needs to be the first stage in order to attack it or to tackle it and change it. Like, we need to make this invisible ways in which domination gets reproduced visible in order to bring about change.
Well, thank you. And again, congratulations on really terrific books. It was an absolute pleasure reading them.